The rain hadn't come to Cedar Hollow in nearly 4 months, and everyone in town could feel it, in the cracked soil, in the dropping water tables, in the tight, worried faces of the farmers who gathered outside the feed store every morning just to talk about the sky, hoping someone had heard a different forecast than the one that had been repeating for weeks. Walter Boone had farmed the same 300 acres his grandfather cleared by hand nearly 70 years earlier, growing corn and soybeans on land that had fed 3 generations of his family through floods, frosts, and at least 2 droughts nobody in town liked to talk about anymore. At 54, Walter wasn't a man who asked for help easily. He'd buried his wife 2 years earlier, raised 2 kids who'd since moved to the city, and kept the farm running mostly through sheer stubbornness and a deep, almost irrational loyalty to the land itself. But that particular drought was different. Without a proper irrigation system, he was watching an entire season die in the field, stalk by stalk, and with it, any real chance of paying down what he already owed on equipment finance the year before. He'd run the numbers a dozen times on the kitchen table late at night, the same numbers, hoping they'd somehow look different by morning. They never did. So Walter did something he'd never done in over 30 years of farming. He ironed his one good shirt, drove into town earlier than usual, and walked into Cedar Hollow National Bank to ask for a loan. He was met by Richard Voss, the bank's regional loan officer, 41 years old, sharp suit, sharper tone, the kind of man who measured people by the numbers on a spreadsheet and little else. Richard had transferred in from the city 2 years earlier, brought in specifically to modernize the branch's lending standards after corporate flagged what they called a pattern of overly generous, sentimental loans to local farmers who didn't always fit the new risk models. Richard had a corner office with a window facing the parking lot, a framed business degree from a school nobody in Cedar Hollow had ever heard of, and a habit of checking his watch mid-conversation that most of his clients had learned to work around. Walter sat across from him, laid his folder on the desk, and walked him through the plan clearly. A modern drip irrigation system, sourced through a regional agricultural supplier at a discounted rate, a projected yield increase based on 3 separate estimates from local agronomists, and a repayment schedule built conservatively around next year's harvest, assuming even a modest recovery in rainfall. It wasn't a reckless request. If anything, it was cautious to a fault. Richard barely looked up from the file, flipping through the pages with visible impatience, occasionally letting out a small sound somewhere between a sigh and a scoff. "Mr. Boone," he said finally, closing the folder halfway, "your current debt-to-asset ratio is already a concern, and frankly, farms like yours are exactly the kind of risk the bank can't justify carrying anymore. No offense, but this isn't the 1980s. We can't keep loaning money based on good intentions and rain dances." A young loan associate sitting near the door let out an awkward laugh before catching herself and pretending to look at her computer screen. Walter sat there in silence for a moment, jaw tight, hat resting in his lap. "This land's fed people through worse droughts than this one," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the heat rising in his chest. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a loan I can pay back, same as I've paid back every loan this bank's given me for 30 years. Richard leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, almost amused by the pushback. "I'm sure you believe that, Mr. Boone. But belief doesn't show up on a balance sheet. I have to answer to people who care about numbers, not nostalgia. It's nothing personal. It's just business." Walter wanted to argue further, wanted to point out that 30 years of on-time payments should count for something, that the land itself was worth more than any spreadsheet formula could calculate, but he'd learned a long time ago that arguing with a man who'd already made up his mind rarely changed anything. He simply nodded, thanked Richard for his time out of old-fashioned habit more than sincerity, and walked out. The official rejection letter came 3 days later, cold and formal, citing elevated agricultural risk exposure as the primary reason for denial. No callback. No alternative financing options offered. No mention of the 30 years of history between Walter's family and that same bank. Just a form letter, stamped and filed away like 1,000 others. Walter didn't cause a scene. He never did. He simply folded the letter along its original creases, tucked it into the glove box of his truck next to an old flashlight and a pair of work gloves, and drove home to figure out, on his own, how he was going to save what was left of the season. What Richard Voss didn't know, what nobody at that bank had ever bothered to ask, was that Walter had already spent nearly a decade quietly building relationships with agricultural researchers at the state university, testing soil retention techniques on a small section of his land that most farmers in the area dismissed outright as experimental nonsense. It hadn't been profitable yet. It wasn't flashy, and it certainly wouldn't have impressed anyone reading a balance sheet. But it was the quiet beginning of something Richard's spreadsheet had no column for. And what Walter didn't know, what nobody in Cedar Hollow knew yet, not even Richard's own wife, was that Richard Voss's financial world was far less stable than his tailored suits and confident tone suggested. Behind the numbers he loved reciting to nervous farmers across his desk, his own household finances were quietly balancing on a foundation far shakier than Walter Boone's cracked, drought-stricken fields. Neither man had any idea, walking out of that meeting on opposite sides of the same tension, just how completely their positions were about to reverse in the months that followed. To understand what happened 6 months later, you have to understand both men fully, not just the brief, tense moment in that bank office, but the very different storms already quietly brewing underneath each of their lives. Walter Boone had never been the kind of farmer who did things the easy way. Where his neighbors leaned entirely on traditional row crop methods passed down unchanged for generations, Walter had spent nearly a decade quietly experimenting on the margins of his land, rotating cover crops, testing low-cost soil moisture sensors built by a graduate student he'd met years earlier at a county extension event, adjusting planting depths based on data nobody else in the county bothered to track. His neighbors called it tinkering. His late wife, Ruth, used to call it stubbornness with a purpose, usually with a fond roll of her eyes as she watched him hunched over yet another notebook full of soil measurements at the kitchen table. After Richard's rejection, Walter didn't have the luxury of despair. He had a harvest to save and very little time to save it. He called in a favor from Dr. Priya Nandan, a soil scientist from the State Agricultural University who had been running small-scale trials on a corner of Walter's land for nearly 2 years, studying drought-resistant planting techniques as part of a larger, underfunded climate resilience grant that hadn't yet produced anything eye-catching enough to attract serious investment. Walter proposed something bold, almost reckless by his usual cautious standards: expand the experimental irrigation approach across a much larger section of his farm, using low-cost materials, salvaged parts, and volunteer labor from other struggling farmers in the area, in exchange for shared data and future savings on their own land. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy. There were nights that summer when Walter and 3 other farmers worked past midnight under truck headlights, laying irrigation lines by hand because they couldn't afford the equipment to do it any faster. Dr. Nandan brought what university funding she could redirect, along with a handful of graduate students eager for real field data. Together, they built something scrappy but functional: a network of low-pressure drip lines fed by a modest solar pump, moisture sensors buried at calculated depths, and a shared spreadsheet, an ordinary one, nothing like the risk models at Cedar Hollow National Bank, tracking soil conditions across every participating farm daily. By midsummer, Walter's fields were noticeably healthier than nearly every other farm in the county, the difference visible even from the road. Neighbors who had once quietly joked about his tinkering started stopping by uninvited, asking questions, offering to help in exchange for a look at how the system worked. Word of it eventually reached the university's research department, who saw in Walter's small, scrappy operation a rare, real-world case study for water-efficient agriculture in exactly the kind of small farming communities their grant was supposed to help in the first place. While Walter was rebuilding his season one hard-won experiment at a time, Richard Voss's world was quietly falling apart in a way none of his colleagues at the bank had any idea about. Richard's aggressive lending cutbacks, the same ones that led him to reject farmers like Walter without a second thought, hadn't come purely from Cedar Hollow's local risk assessments. They were part of a broader strategy Richard had pushed onto corporate leadership himself, hoping the improved short-term numbers would finally secure him a regional promotion he'd been chasing for over a year. Confident that promotion was close, Richard had quietly stretched his own family's finances into an ambitious real estate investment, a small strip of rental properties on the edge of a nearby growing suburb, based on projections that assumed both the local housing market and his own career would keep climbing steadily upward. Instead, corporate leadership, unimpressed by his aggressive rural cutbacks and the community backlash they generated, including 2 angry letters to the editor in the local paper and a noticeable dip in new account openings across the branch, passed him over for the promotion entirely, awarding it instead to a regional manager known for a very different, more community-focused lending philosophy. Shortly afterward, in a move that had nothing to do with Richard specifically, Cedar Hollow National Bank was acquired in a regional merger that eliminated his position altogether, along with several others at branches deemed redundant under the new ownership structure. Richard didn't tell his wife, Michelle, right away. For nearly 2 weeks, he kept driving to an office that technically no longer existed for him, sitting in his car in an increasingly empty parking lot, trying to figure out exactly how to explain that the confident investment he'd made, the one built entirely on the assumption of continued financial stability and career growth, was quickly becoming impossible to sustain on a shrinking severance package and no real prospects lined up. By the time Richard finally sat Michelle down at their kitchen table and told her the truth, their overextended mortgage payments were already 2 months behind, and the rental properties he'd been counting on to cover the gap were sitting mostly unsold in a market that had cooled far faster than his original projections ever accounted for. Michelle, to her credit, didn't yell. She simply asked him one quiet question that stuck with him for weeks afterward. Did you ever once consider that the people you kept turning down might have known something you didn't? Meanwhile, Walter Boone's farm was becoming something of a quiet local legend, though Walter himself barely noticed the shift happening around him. Word had spread about the university partnership, about the yield numbers holding steady despite the worst drought the county had seen in over a decade, about a small, informal group of farmers pooling resources under Walter's guidance to survive a season that had crushed farms all around them. Neither man had any idea, as that summer stretched into fall, just how close their paths were about to cross again, or how completely the balance of power between them was about to shift. By early spring, Walter Boone's farm had become something no one in Cedar Hollow could have predicted 6 months earlier. A working, thriving example of exactly the kind of risk Richard Voss had once dismissed outright, without a second thought, from behind his corner office desk. The university's small research partnership, once considered a minor side project barely worth the grant funding it received, expanded into a formal pilot program backed by a larger state agricultural grant specifically designed to bring Walter's low-cost irrigation and soil retention techniques to other struggling farms across the region. Dr. Nanden's carefully documented data showed yields on Walter's fields outperforming even some of the larger, far better-funded operations nearby, a detail that eventually caught the attention of a regional agricultural cooperative actively looking to invest in sustainable, community-driven farming initiatives. The cooperative sent 2 representatives to walk Walter's land personally, spending the better part of a day examining his irrigation lines, questioning Dr. Nanden about the data, and talking with the neighboring farmers who'd volunteered their labor the previous summer. What they found impressed them enough to move quickly. Within weeks, they offered Walter something he never expected to hear in his lifetime, a leadership role helping coordinate the expansion of the pilot program across 3 neighboring counties, along with formal funding to fully scale the irrigation system on his own land, the very system Richard Voss had once flatly denied him a loan to build, calling it a risk the bank simply couldn't justify. Walter didn't gloat about any of it. He didn't tell anyone at Cedar Hollow National Bank, and truthfully, he barely thought about Richard Voss at all during those months. He simply kept working, quietly building something far bigger and more lasting than the modest loan he'd originally walked into that bank hoping for. Richard Voss, meanwhile, was living a very different reality entirely. After months of unemployment, a canceled real estate deal that fell through at the worst possible moment, and a mortgage default that nearly cost his family their home, Richard had taken a significantly smaller position at a regional agricultural lending nonprofit, an organization ironically focused entirely on helping small farmers access the kind of capital traditional banks like his former employer were often unwilling to offer. It wasn't the career trajectory he had once confidently imagined for himself. It paid barely enough to keep his family afloat, and it required him to relearn, humbly, everything he thought he'd already understood about agricultural risk. The work itself was a slow, sometimes humbling education. Richard spent his first few weeks simply shadowing loan officers who spoke with farmers the way Walter had once hoped to be spoken to, asking about soil conditions, equipment history, and long-term plans, rather than reducing an entire livelihood to a single ratio on a spreadsheet. More than once, Richard caught himself wanting to interject with the same confident dismissals he once used so easily, and more than once, he forced himself to stay quiet and simply listen instead. It was through this new, far less glamorous job that Richard first heard Walter Boone's name again, not as a rejected file buried in a drawer, but as a featured case study circulated in an internal nonprofit newsletter, highlighting successful small farm resilience projects happening across the state. Richard read the short article twice, slowly, before he fully processed exactly who it was describing. A few weeks later, the Cooperative Expansion Program Walter now helped lead needed a temporary logistics coordinator, someone who understood agricultural lending processes, cooperative financial structures, and regional farm data well enough to help manage the paperwork and funding distribution for the newly approved counties joining the program. Richard's new employer, entirely unaware of any history between the two men, put his name forward for the temporary contract role, specifically citing his prior banking background as a strong fit for the position's financial reporting requirements. When Richard walked into the small community center where the cooperative program was being coordinated that morning, he expected an anonymous meeting with unfamiliar faces, another routine interview in a long string of them since losing his position. Instead, he found himself standing across a folding table from Walter Boone. For a long, uncomfortable moment, neither man said anything at all. Richard, visibly caught off guard, opened his mouth as if to explain himself, but nothing useful came out immediately. Walter simply studied him for a moment, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet, almost startled recognition of a man seeing exactly how much had changed in 6 short months. "Mr. Voss," Walter finally said, his tone even, neither warm nor cold, just steady. "Didn't expect to see you on this side of the table." Richard swallowed hard, his confident posture from 6 months earlier nowhere to be found. "Neither did I," he admitted quietly. I need this contract, Mr. Boone. My family needs it." The irony wasn't lost on either of them, hanging heavy in the small, plain room. The same man who once dismissed Walter's careful, conservative loan request as reckless nostalgia was now depending entirely on Walter's judgment to determine whether he'd get the modest, badly needed work in front of him. Walter Boone had every reason in the world to walk away. He could have said absolutely nothing, quietly passed Richard's name along to someone else on the cooperative board without comment, and let the decision play out without ever having to look the man in the eye again. Nobody would have blamed him for that. Not after everything. Instead, Walter did something Richard clearly wasn't expecting at all. "Sit down," Walter said,